In the dead of night, the narrow waterway that feeds the world's energy system could become the most dangerous strip of sea on Earth. Not with a formal declaration of war, not with a giant fleet charging across the horizon, but with swarms of drones, coastal anti-ship missiles, naval mines, fast attack craft, and a sudden burst of radar silence that tells every commander in the region the same thing. The Strait of Hormuz is no longer secure. If Iran moved to impose real control over that choke point, even for a matter of hours, the shock would not stay at sea. It would hit oil markets, military planners, regional alliances, and the image of American naval dominance all at once. Picture the opening moments of that scenario. A wave of loitering munitions rises from concealed positions near the Iranian coast, while anti-ship batteries go live along the mountains overlooking the shipping lanes, and unmanned surface craft push outward into the dark. Commercial tankers halt, insurance rates explode, naval escorts scramble, and every command center from Bahrain to Washington starts receiving contradictory reports in real time. No capital city would need to see a sinking carrier for the message to land. If the world's most important energy corridor can be frozen under the shadow of Iranian firepower, then the entire balance of power in the Gulf enters a new and dangerous phase. And that is the central question of this video. Has Iran found a way to challenge the United States, not by matching it ship for ship, but by turning geography, missiles, drones, and economic pressure into a strategic weapon? Because if the answer is even partially yes, then the old assumptions about who controls the Gulf, who protects global trade, and who dictates escalation no longer look as solid as they once did. Before we break this down, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and tell me in the comments if a crisis erupts in the Strait of Hormuz. Do you believe Washington would force the passage open immediately, or would it hesitate to avoid a wider regional war? How would Iran try to do it without triggering instant total war? Why might American and Allied defenses struggle in such a compressed and crowded battle space? Why is Washington's greatest strength at sea also one of its political vulnerabilities? And what would it mean for American power, for oil prices, and for the emerging multipolar order if even the perception of Iranian control became credible? So to understand the gravity of this scenario, you have to understand the map. The Strait of Hormuz is not just another maritime passage. It is a narrow artery between the Persian Gulf and the Arabian Sea, a choke point through which a massive share of the world's seaborne oil and gas flows every single day. In strategic terms, it is a pressure valve on the global economy. In military terms, it is a confined battle space where distance favors the defender and where the side operating from shore can compress. Reaction time to terrifyingly short windows, that matters because the United States Navy is built for power projection across oceans. It is unmatched in sustained blue water operations, carrier aviation, long-range logistics, and coalition warfare. But the Strait of Hormuz is not the open Pacific. It is a dense, shallow, heavily monitored, missile-swept environment framed by hostile coastlines, civilian shipping traffic, and overlapping radar and drone coverage. In such a place, dominance becomes more fragile than it looks in official briefings. Iran has understood this for years. It cannot outbuild the United States in carriers. It cannot win a symmetric naval war in the traditional sense. So it has invested in a different model: anti-access and area denial, layered across land, sea, and air, designed not necessarily to destroy the entire American fleet, but to make intervention costly, risky, politically explosive, and economically unbearable. That model is built on saturation. Not one missile, but many. Not one drone, but waves. Not one axis of attack, but several at once. Coastal cruise missiles, ballistic anti-ship systems, naval mines, explosive drone boats, submarines, shore-based rocket artillery, electronic warfare, and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy's doctrine of harassment and swarm pressure all fit into one strategic idea: overwhelm the decision cycle of a larger enemy operating in a narrow corridor. Imagine a crisis timeline. In the early hours before dawn, Iranian coastal surveillance began shadowing tanker traffic, while civilian navigation systems in parts of the Gulf experience unexplained interference. Minutes later, merchant captains report fast contacts on radar, and a pair of suspicious unmanned craft are observed near a traffic separation lane. Then the first real shock hits. A tanker suffers damage from what appears to be a mine or a drone strike. Another vessel turns sharply and collides in panic, and shipping movement stops almost instantly. Within the next wave, Iran does not need to sink half the Gulf to create strategic paralysis. It only needs enough visible disruption to convince insurers, shipping companies, and energy traders that safe passage no longer exists. A handful of successful strikes, or even credible near misses under the threat of more to come, could send oil futures surging before a single large naval battle even begins. In modern warfare, perception is not a side issue, it is part of the weapon. Then comes the military layer. American destroyers and Allied escorts would move to secure lanes and identify launch points. Carrier aircraft might begin combat air patrols, surveillance flights, and suppression missions. But in this scenario, Iran's objective would not be to stand in the open and absorb punishment. It would be to create a rolling threat environment where every radar contact could be a decoy, every fishing boat could hide a sensor, every commercial traffic cluster could complicate target identification, and every delay magnifies the economic shock. This is where the phrase control becomes more complicated than occupation. Iran does not need to physically own every square mile of water. It needs the ability to deny confidence, deny predictability, and deny safe, routine transit. That is enough to challenge dominance. Because naval supremacy is not just the ability to fight, it is the ability to guarantee order. And if that guarantee fails, even temporarily, credibility takes a hit that no press conference can easily repair. Now let's talk about the weapon systems that matter in such a confrontation. Iran has spent years building missile forces intended to threaten ships, bases, logistics hubs, and command centers across the Gulf. Analysts often point to systems in the Fate family, anti-ship variants associated with names like Khalij Fars, cruise missiles designed for coastal launch, and a steadily expanding drone arsenal. Whether every public claim about their range and precision is accurate is not the point. The point is that Iran has created enough uncertainty to force every opposing planner to assume the threat is serious. Drones are especially important here. They are cheap compared with high-end interceptors. They can be launched in numbers. They can serve as decoys, reconnaissance platforms, or explosive strike assets. In a strait packed with commercial signatures, atmospheric clutter, and short engagement windows, drones are not just weapons, they are confusion engines. And confusion is priceless when you are trying to blunt the advantages of a larger navy. Then there are mines, one of the oldest tools in naval warfare and still one of the most effective in confined waters. Mines do not need cinematic explosions every hour to achieve strategic effect, and their power lies in fear, delay, and the slow grinding process of clearance. The mere suspicion of mined approaches can freeze commercial traffic, tie up specialized assets, and force warships into defensive patterns that reduce their flexibility. A superpower can destroy missile launchers from the air, but mine warfare punishes speed and punishes certainty. Fast attack craft fit into the same doctrine. They are not built to duel cruisers in open seas. They are built to swarm, probe, distract, launch short-range weapons, and force expensive ships to respond to cheap threats. This is the core cost exchange problem. A multi-million-dollar interceptor fired at a low-cost drone or small attack boat may be tactically necessary, But strategically, it favors the side willing to trade quantity for pressure. Electronic warfare would likely sit underneath all of this, like an invisible layer of fog, jamming, spoofing, disrupted communications, false signatures, degraded navigation, and intermittent sensor blindness can turn a tense maritime corridor into a nightmare of delayed judgment. In modern combat, the side that can distort the enemy's picture, even for brief windows, can create openings out of all proportion to the technology involved. Now, consider the American side of the equation. The United States still possesses overwhelming military capabilities. It can surge air power, long-range strike assets, intelligence support, carrier aviation, submarines, missile defense, and coalition escorts into the theater. But capacity is not the same as frictionless execution. Every response would be shaped by political caution, alliance, coordination, civilian shipping risks, escalation management, and the terrifying possibility that a move intended to reopen the Strait could ignite a regional war stretching from Iraq and Syria to the Red Sea and beyond. That is why Washington may appear powerful and hesitant at the same time. The Pentagon can draw up plans for convoy protection, suppression of coastal batteries, strikes on missile infrastructure, and maritime clearance operations. But every plan contains a hidden question. What happens next? If the first round of retaliation kills senior Iranian commanders or hits critical infrastructure, does Tehran double down? Does it activate proxy forces across the region? Does it threaten Gulf energy facilities, American bases, or allied cities? The military map cannot be separated from the escalation ladder. Israel would watch such a crisis with extreme alarm, even if the main battleground were Maritimes. Any demonstration that Iran can impose strategic costs on the United States in the Gulf would ripple directly into Israeli security calculations. It would raise urgent questions about missile defense saturation, regional deterrence, and the reliability of external rescue under pressure. For years, one of the pillars of regional order has been this assumption that American military superiority can stabilize crises before they reshape the map. A successful Iranian challenge in Hormuz would shake that assumption hard. The Gulf Arab states would also face a brutal dilemma. Many depend on American security guarantees, many fear Iranian coercion. Yet many also dread becoming launch pads in a spiraling war they cannot control. So even as they call for protection of navigation, some may quietly push for de-escalation, back-channel diplomacy, or a limited settlement that restores shipping without crossing into full-scale conflict. That tension would matter because the United States projects power more effectively when regional partners are aligned, not when they are nervous, fragmented, and hedging. And hedging is the word that increasingly defines the era. Across the Middle East, states are trying to balance between Washington, Beijing, Moscow, and their own regional calculations. They are buying weapons from one side, signing infrastructure deals with another, talking to rivals they once isolated, and treating the future as less certain than it looked a generation ago. A Strait of Hormuz crisis would accelerate that trend. If American naval dominance looks challengeable, then every capital begins planning for a world in which no single outside power can guarantee order alone. This is where oil markets become a strategic battlefield of their own. A disruption in Hormuz would not need to last for months to cause enormous damage. Energy markets react to fear, to expected shortages, to transport risk, to insurance spikes, and to the possibility of cascading retaliation against export infrastructure. The world economy, already strained by inflation, debt, supply chain fragility, and geopolitical fragmentation, could absorb the shock badly. And when economies panic, governments panic with them. That gives Iran a form of leverage that goes beyond naval combat. Tehran understands that the Strait is not just a military choke point, it is a financial detonator. The threat of disruption can pressure rivals, complicate sanctions, divide coalitions, and raise the global cost of any attempt to isolate Iran completely. In that sense, control is psychological as much as physical. It is the ability to force everyone else to calculate around your capacity for disruption. Now let's reconstruct a more detailed military scenario step by step, not as confirmed reporting, but as a plausible crisis sequence. In the first phase, Iran disperses launchers, drones, and small naval units well before any public trigger, using camouflage, hardened sites, civilian masking, and redundant command nodes. In the second phase, it floods the information space with ambiguity, warnings to shipping, military exercises, electronic interference, and selective shows of force. In the third phase, after a triggering event, it executes a sharp burst of disruption designed to create immediate commercial paralysis before the United States can establish a stable operating picture. From launch to impact, some engagements in the Strait could unfold in minutes. A drone wave appears first, perhaps low and slow, drawing sensors and interceptors. Then come anti-ship missiles from multiple coastal angles, maybe mixed with decoys. Small craft move aggressively toward traffic lanes, while mine deployment, real or suspected, expands the crisis geometry. At the same time, cyber interference and jamming muddy the command picture. By the time the first formal briefings are assembled, the economic effect is already racing around the planet. The most dangerous element here is not necessarily catastrophic destruction, it is compressed decision time. Naval commanders may have to distinguish between civilian and hostile signatures in a crowded sea while under political constraints and live media scrutiny. Political leaders may have to choose between restraint that looks weak and retaliation that may trigger a regional inferno. Traders may front-run worst-case outcomes in hours in a crisis like this. Time becomes the enemy of everyone trying to restore order. Could American air power simply wipe out the threat? It could certainly inflict massive damage on exposed Iranian assets. The United States retains extraordinary strike capability, but this is not a clean laboratory problem. Mobile launchers relocate. Underground storage protects inventory. Short-range systems hide in terrain. Civilian proximity complicates targeting. And no air campaign, however powerful, instantly erases the danger of mines, residual missiles, distributed drones, and follow-on proxy escalation across the region. That is the heart of anti-access strategy. You do not need to defeat the superpower everywhere. You need to make intervention uncertain, expensive, and politically corrosive right where it matters most. In the Strait of Hormuz, Iran's geography does much of the work for it. The coastline overlooks the lanes. Distances are tight. The defender can prepare in advance. The attacker, even if stronger, must enter the trap while carrying the burden of protecting commerce, allies, and its own prestige. Prestige matters more than many officials admit. For decades, the United States Navy has symbolized more than military strength. It has symbolized the promise that sea lanes remain open under American protection. That promise underpins alliances, trade patterns, insurance assumptions, and the broader architecture of global confidence. If that promise looks vulnerable in one of the world's most critical choke points, rivals take notes, allies get nervous, and every unresolved dispute from East Asia to the Eastern Mediterranean starts to look different. Russia would see such a development as proof that American pressure has limits. Moscow has long argued that the era of uncontested Western coercion is ending, not because the United States has become weak, but because its adversaries have learned how to exploit the costs of intervention. China would study the lesson even more carefully. Beijing is deeply dependent on Gulf energy flows, yet it is also deeply interested in a world where the United States can no longer act as the unchallenged maritime gatekeeper. A crisis in Hormuz would therefore create both danger and opportunity for China at the same time. North Korea, too, would draw conclusions. So would every state under sanctions or strategic pressure. The lesson would not be that America cannot fight. Everyone knows it can. The lesson would be that denial strategies, layered missiles, drones, and economic choke points can impose hesitation even on the strongest military machine in the world. That is a powerful message in an age where more states are investing in asymmetric deterrence instead of conventional parity. And then there is Iran's self-reliance story, which matters politically as much as militarily. Decades of sanctions, isolation attempts, and external pressure were meant in part to constrain Tehran's capabilities. But they also pushed Iran to build domestic missile production, drone innovation, underground infrastructure, dispersed logistics, and strategic patience. Sanctions did hurt. They did impose costs. But they also helped create a state that thinks constantly about survival through denial, adaptation, and indirect leverage. And that is one reason why coercion has not produced the submission many once predicted. If a Hormuz crisis unfolded and Iran managed even a temporary display of effective control, the narrative shock would be enormous. It would say that a sanctioned regional power operating under constant pressure had found a way to challenge the core operating assumptions of the world's premier naval power in one of the most vital maritime choke points on Earth. The symbolism would travel far beyond the Gulf. It would speak to a planet already questioning whether the unipolar moment is fading for good. And of course, none of this means American power disappears. That would be an overstatement. The United States would still possess the capacity to escalate, absorb, strike back, and rally allies. It could reopen lanes over time. It could punish Iran severely. It could reassert a degree of control through sustained operations. But the key issue is different. Could it do so quickly, cheaply, and without risking a broader war? That is where the aura of invincibility starts to crack. And that crack matters because deterrence lives partly in perception. Once adversaries believe the United States can be delayed, complicated, and politically constrained in high-stakes theaters, they adjust their behavior. They probe more. They coordinate more. They invest more heavily in denial systems. They rely less on old fears and more on the confidence that the American response, though formidable, may no longer be automatic or strategically clean. There is also a domestic, American dimension. Any prolonged disruption in the Strait of Hormuz would feed directly into fuel prices, inflation, anxiety, market turbulence, and political pressure at home. A president facing election cycles, divided institutions, and public fatigue with endless Middle Eastern crises may find that even justified military action comes wrapped in sharp political cost. Tehran understands this. It does not need to defeat the United States on the battlefield in some grand cinematic finale. It only needs to make the price of restoring order uncomfortably high. So when people ask whether Iran can control the Strait of Hormuz, the right answer is not a simplistic yes or no. If control means permanent, uncontested ownership, then no. If control means the ability to threaten closure, disrupt traffic, impose fear, challenge naval assumptions, and trigger economic shock large enough to force the world to react on Iran's terms, and then the answer becomes much harder to dismiss. And that is exactly why this issue is so dangerous. Because once the threshold of credibility is crossed, deterrence changes. Tanker operators change routes, insurers rewrite risk, regional governments hedge, great powers recalculate their commitments, markets price in instability, and every military planner in Washington has to confront the same uncomfortable reality. Superiority on paper does not always translate into effortless control in a narrow, missile-swept corridor under the shadow of a determined regional power. If such a crisis erupts, the first battle may not be the battle of ships and missiles. It may be the battle of will, timing, and narrative. Can Iran convince the world that it can hold the choke point at risk longer than the United States can tolerate the political and economic fallout? Can Washington restore confidence before energy panic spreads? Can allies stay united when escalation threatens their own cities and oil infrastructure? These are not side questions. They are the war. And this is why the Strait of Hormuz remains one of the most explosive fault lines on the planet. A narrow body of water, a huge concentration of energy flows, rival militaries on hair-trigger alert. Regional alliances under strain, global powers circling, sanctions, proxy warfare, prestige, deterrence, and survival all converging in one compressed arena where a few hours of disruption could redraw months of diplomacy. If the old order was built on the assumption that sea power guarantees stability, then Hormuz is where that assumption could be tested most brutally. If the myth was that American naval dominance alone could deter any regional challenge, then a credible Iranian denial campaign would shatter part of that myth even before the shooting fully stopped. And if the emerging world is truly multipolar, then this is exactly what it looks like. Not one empire collapsing overnight, but multiple powers learning how to resist, complicate, and reshape the terms of force. The old order is not disappearing in silence. It is being stressed, pressured, and challenged in choke points, proxy fronts, cyber corridors, and energy markets. The myth of invincibility is not broken by a single headline. It is broken when enough actors start believing that the giant can be delayed, bloodied, and politically boxed in. That is the deeper significance of Iran's leverage over the Strait of Hormuz. So the next time someone says this is just another Gulf standoff, look closer. This is about more than one strait. It is about whether geography can outweigh tonnage, whether missiles and drones can humble fleets, whether economic fear can become a strategic weapon, and whether the balance of power is shifting faster than many in Washington are willing to admit. If this analysis made you think, hit like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you do not miss the next breakdown. And tell me in the comments, if Iran moved to assert real control over the Strait of Hormuz, would the United States break that challenge quickly, or are we already entering a world where even the strongest navy can no longer guarantee the old rules alone?